Wall Street has become Las Vegas without borders. That's what's going on. Investors investing in doing nothing else except making money with their money. Now, when you're going to make money with your money, you don't do a lot with food for poor people because they don't give you much money. So thousands and thousands of acres in the global south have been transformed from local production for local consumption into growing winter fruit and vegetables for us folks up here. It's only us folks that can't eat, that don't eat locally and don't have to eat seasonally. How can we change this? The means to discipline global capitalism to higher moral purposes, such as decreasing inequality and increasing environmental sustainability. Right now, we are increasing inequality and decreasing global sustainability. How can we turn that around in 1 minute? The means for doing that are already at hand. They are called, now this is going to be a surprise, they are called the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Of course, these institutions are presently protecting and enhancing capital in its present use and form. But that could be changed. Changed to construct a very different international financial playing field. Profits are fine, markets are fine. But now what would be awarded with profits and market share would be investments that decrease global inequalities and or increase environmental sustainability. I know you think that's just sky blue dreaming, but stay with me for another 30 seconds. Corporations would continue, hedge funds would continue, but now under radically transformed rules of the global investment game. Can you imagine what it would be like to have global corporations and international hedge funds competing with each other for market share and profits that feed everyone in the world healthful and secure food, competing under those new rules of the market? Can you imagine what it would be like to have global corporations forced by the new rules of the international financial game to compete with one another for increased environmental sustainability? Can you imagine, as I can imagine, that as this conversation about how to address the increasing inequality and unsustainability of present market practices, as that conversation grows and expands, can you imagine that some CEOs of major corporations, even some hedge fund managers, might begin to say, yes, so long as all the folks competing for my market share or my profits have to play by these same new rules, I like that. Why? Because I have grandchildren. And the way the world is working right now just won't work much longer. Profits and markets have a place, but they must be kept in that place. They must be disciplined to re-enter the commons and serve the common good of the whole human family. All world religions can and should agree on that. It is the common sense of our collective moral traditions. And when world religions recognize that and act upon what they know and change the world, then, when the world has been changed, our grandchildren will sing our praises, because we do not inherit this world from our parents. We borrow this world from our grandchildren. And they will know whether we have been good grandparents or, God forbid, failed grandparents. Today, that choice is ours. But tomorrow, it is our grandchildren who will have the final say about us and how we lived our lives.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Kovic.
I want to start by thanking the Gulen Institute for holding this event today, and also for the many important events that they carry out in Houston and the broader community. So thank you. The use of the term social justice in the title of this panel is important. It forces us to consider not only those who live in poverty, but the political and economic structures that produce poverty. And I have a series of images. I begin with this image of a train in southern Mexico, which powerfully reveals the coexistence of poverty and injustice. And this ties in with what Dr. Rains was speaking about on the movement of people and commodities. Each year, thousands of Central American migrants ride atop freight trains to cross Mexico in their journey toward the United States. On the trains, migrants are exposed to rain, extreme temperatures, dehydration, and electrocution as they pass under power lines. And this is another image of people on the train. Many have lost limbs or their lives as a result of falling from the trains onto the tracks below. At the same time, the train's legitimate cargo is carried in protected cars. And this illustrates the paradox of free trade agreements and new security policies. While goods and capital move freely between the US and Mexico, the free movement of poor workers is prohibited. While private security guards protect the commodities in the train, the migrants themselves are vulnerable to theft, illness, injury, detention, and amputation. They jump this freight train, it's not a passenger train, to try to avoid the many migration checkpoints set up in southern Mexico under pressure from the United States government. For these poor migrants, it's almost impossible to obtain a visa to legally enter the United States, and this is why they're forced to choose the train. This is just a map to give you a sense of the path migrants take, some of the paths in crossing Mexico. And while these migrants face tremendous violence in their journey toward the US, they also encounter tremendous acts of generosity, coming from other migrants, from Mexican and US residents, and from churches and others. This generosity contrasts sharply with the hostility toward them from anti-immigrant groups and restrictive immigration laws. Acts of generosity, which can involve giving to those in need, hospitality, and solidarity, powerfully challenge the view of undocumented migrants as a burden and a threat to society. So my presentation focuses on this generosity more than the violence migrants face. This image, it's the only one that's not from myself or my family. It's from the Los Angeles Times. It shows one powerful example of the people throughout Mexico who meet the train and assist migrants. Indeed, in the southern state of Veracruz, when the train slows down, people hand the migrants food, water, and sandwiches. And women, sometimes organizing themselves through local churches, prepare these foods to give to the migrants. A priest in Oaxaca starts to make sandwiches as soon as he knows that the train is on its way, and he complains that he doesn't have enough time to make more food for them. The migrants also share their limited resources with one another. They share food, water, and information about the journey. When interviewing those who had suffered severe injuries, they had been amputated by the train, I heard time and again about those who risked everything to help them. That is, fellow travelers jumped from the train and sought assistance, knowing that they risked being detained and deported by authorities and would be forced to find the money to begin their journey again from Central America. In one shelter I was visiting, when a baby was born to a couple, the migrants took up a collection among themselves to help the family, and as one man observed, people don't give from what is left over, but from what they themselves need. Shelters throughout Mexico provide places for migrants to eat, sleep, rest, and gather information before continuing their journey north. The majority are run by the Catholic Church and draw from principles of Catholic social teaching, which defend the dignity and rights of migrants and identify Jesus Christ as a migrant who fled into Egypt. The shelter of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, located near Mexico's border with Guatemala, provides a space for healing for Central American migrants who have been injured. The shelter is home to many who have lost limbs on the train, and it's run by Olga Sanchez, who's shown here. She often runs about the city seeking money for supplies, seeking blood donations, and doctors who will volunteer their time to perform surgery. In doing so, she involves many migrants living near the border in the lives of Central Americans passing through. And on a few years ago, when she was able to put together the money to purchase land to build a new shelter, the very migrants who had lost limbs on the train were the very people who did the work of building a new shelter. Migrants also seek support at the Bethlehem shelter in Saltillo in northern Mexico. This mural painted outside depicts Christ among migrants being detained by an immigration official. And it reflects a common theme in the Catholic Church of encountering Christ among the poor. Each week, hundreds of Central American migrants pass through this shelter. Further north, at the U.S.-Mexico border, people volunteer with such groups as No More Death, Humane Borders, and Angels of the Desert. They provide water for those crossing. They wash people's feet and attend to their wounds, and even help recover bodies of those who have died. In Houston, Casa Juan Diego runs several shelters based on the model of hospitality of Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement. And central to the movement is personalism, described as the focus on the human person made in the image and likeness of God. So these are just some examples of generosity. I could give many more. They're both everyday and extraordinary, and they're significant on many levels. First, it's critical to acknowledge that they help people's material survival. Migrants rely on food, water, and medical attention and other items to survive their journey. But these acts of generosity also go against the grain of society of seeking one's own self-interest or profit. They
powerfully contest views of migrants in the United States as people who simply take much-needed resources and are a burden to society. Profit-driven media gives visibility to anti-immigrant groups, but not much to solidarity toward and among the poor. In addition, immigrants aren't burdens. They're people who are active. They're people on the move. But they do carry the burden of injustice. In his book, The Renewal of Generosity, sociologist Arthur Frank writes of medical generosity as being the grace to welcome those who suffer. It is more than giving care, what he writes about. It is an opening of the self to the other, a welcome, a hospitality, without expectation of anything in return. And so these examples of generosity toward and among migrants involve significant face-to-face interaction with others. They're not about writing a check or sending a text message and with those in need remain faceless. Instead, people give of themselves, often in the form of time, work, and sharing their scarce resources. These are encounters. They involve face-to-face interactions which humanize the stranger or the other and provide a way to recognize our common needs across differences and a way of recognizing ourselves in the face of the other. At times, through these face-to-face interactions, personal stories are shared. The Mexican women who give food to Central Americans often have family members living in the United States. So they know of the difficulties that migrants face, and in many ways they give because they already know the story. In other cases, those who are generous, those who open themselves to others, truly listen and hear people's stories for the first time and have a change of heart. In this sense, generosity can bring empathy, a standing with others, what Arthur Frank calls the grace to welcome those who suffer. But there can be limits to generosity, especially if in giving one only connects to others as needy. Giving food, water, and medical care is urgent, indeed life-saving. Yet if generosity stops with giving, it will not transform social structures. A decade ago, Brazilian educator Paulo Freire called charity a false generosity because giving handouts maintained rather than challenged hierarchical power structures. He They called for a solidarity and accompaniment, walking with the poor in their journey, sharing some of their risks, and joining in efforts